She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back down, me now a come home. Inaga jackass yard to fetch the load. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Red Sea and Rover from the farm. Them
All right. Hey, good morning and welcome to another episode of AWI, that is Anansi Web Education. And, I'm stepping up there age-wise, and sometimes morning and night I get confused with it. But good evening, everybody, and welcome. I noticed Mr. Granger is already smiling at that comment. Good evening to you, sir. How are you?
Good evening, Mark. Good evening, viewers and listeners. It's good that we are still at the start of the year, and we look forward to having a good year of education with Anansi Web. So I'm feeling good. I'm very confident that we'll have successful collaboration and communication with our thousands of viewers in Guyana and in the diaspora. I'm good.
Thank you so much. Collaboration and communication with the viewers in Guyana and in the diaspora as well. I was listening to this song, the introduction, and it reminds me of quarantine country life. You're running somewhere and the dog is always there next to you, running next to you. Regardless, wherever you go, that dog is there. We had a little brown dog, and so it brought back some very, very good memories of the country life. And I'm sure that the many years you spent, or the time you spent between Auckland and Wim Village, you had that experience as well, country life, country style.
Yeah, you're quite correct. It was those were days before the road was paved, and many people would ride to and from work or to and from school or walk to school. I could walk to Auckland from Wim, of course. But you're right. It was a simple life, and the roadways were not as congested now with so many accidents. And there was always a dog. Even if it was not your dog, you might invest his time in you, hoping to get a free meal.
Absolutely. I meant to ask you, because you live right not to a stone throw away from Wim Police Station, because that was the compound. What was the station lockups like? Were people in and out? Was it overcrowded, or what was?
No, it was not really. I mean, sometimes you may have a case of petty theft or drunkenness, but it was not a scene, or that area was not a scene of serious criminality. Remember that many stations in the colonial era were established not to not to protect citizens, but to protect sugar interests,
Gotcha.
So it was not, of course, Wem was largely made up of, in my view, persons of Tamil descent, and they were fisher folk mostly. It was like a fishing village. But we didn't have serious criminality at that time. And I don't think that there were many places under quarantine in the early 1950s which had criminality. I think a lot of criminality came in the 1960s with the political violence that we saw on the sugar plantations, which is this topic we're going to deal with today, the most violent strike in Guyana's history.
It's kind of like making me nervous to get into this the most violent strike in 1964 and the PPP's hands in all of that. But before we get to that, though, what was the transportation mode for the sugar workers on the quarantine at that time? Because during my time, they had what we looked forward for the cane cutter trucks, because the guys on the cane cutter trucks, if they were nice, they will cut you a nice 2 pieces a cane and so forth. What was it like? How did you get to work?
By the mid 60s, because of representation by the MPCA, the sugar union, conditions were improving, and people were transported to the work site. They didn't have to ride their own catamus, the old bicycles, to the back dam. A truck would take them there. And of course, that's made them vulnerable. Instead of going one by one, you'd have 30 people, 30 workers in a truck, and that's why they became vulnerable to bombing and to murders. But it was mechanized by then, and it was still, they had only about 11 grinding estates, because the sugar industry has always been shrinking. And of course, most of them were controlled by Booker Sugar Estates. But the transportation was mostly by truck or lorry, whatever you call it.
All right, thank you. And those of you who are now joining us, good evening to you and welcome to GAWU. Let's get straight into today's program. And it has to do with the People's Progressive Party again. And a lot of you will get to hear maybe for the first time, or for those of you who would be reminded about the PPP and their acts of terrorism throughout Guyana. We're still seeing a little signs of that, 2020 acts of terrorism, beating up of school children, stoning of buses, school buses, and all manner of things. But today, let us just bring to your attention that the People's Progressive Party introduced terrorism and violence to Guyana. I wish to repeat that, so especially the younger generation would never forget this, that the People's Progressive Party introduced terrorism and violence to Guyana. The strike by the PPP-affiliated Guyana Agriculture Workers Union, GAWU, during the hurricane of protest of 1964, known as the disturbances, started in February and lasted until July 1964. 165 days. Acts of terror, hurricane of protest, terrorism by the PPP and the PPP-affiliated Guyana Agriculture Workers Union. It was the longest and most violent labor union strike in this country, in Guyana's history. February 2024 marks the 60th anniversary of the start of the deadly GAWU strike. Let's begin our program this evening as we pose our first question to President David Arthur Granger. What factors, Mr. Granger, what factors led to GAWU strike in 1964?
As an observer, looking at the PPP and GAWU from the outside, I can only surmise based on newspaper reports and based on my own analysis. Of course, I'm sure the PPP and GAWU might have had other reasons. But in my view, the foremost reason was the desire to control both the legislature, the government, and the trade union movement. Now, we must remember that when the PPP, what I call the original PPP, went into office in 1953 after the April elections, they were allowed to, by the Constitution, allowed to elect members of the Executive Council. And I think 5 of the 6 members were active trade unionists. So there was always a nexus between the party and the trade unions. And in my view, the strike by the Guyana Industrial Workers Union in August 1953 triggered the suspension of the constitution. But coming back to your specific question, the PPP is a Leninist party. Leninism has nothing to do with communism. Leninism has to do with control, pure and simple. And the PPP felt that under the first past the post system, it would control the legislature, at that time the Legislative Council, in perpetuity because they felt they had a built-in majority. That is why they were so opposed to proportional representation, which destroyed that built-in majority. So they felt that they could continue to control the legislature, and they now needed to control the labor movement, which was the strongest assembly of workers outside of the government. And they felt by controlling the Legislative Council and controlling the labor movement, they could be dictators for life, literally. So the quest for control by a Leninist party, an avowed Leninist party, and I believe that it is correct to say that in 2024, the PPP's constitution still proclaims that it's a Leninist party. And if you understand Leninism, you understand it is aimed at control, pure and simple. So it was a matter of controlling governments and the labor movement. The second, I would say, factor was that it always felt that the public service and the public sector in general did not support the PPP. So by controlling the labor movement, it felt that it would be able to control the public service, and by controlling the government, control the public service as well. So it felt that it was a means of controlling its opponents. It would render its opponents powerless because they control the government. They could pass whatever laws they wanted, pass whatever budget they wanted, and they could also control the labor union. So when people try to strike, you know, the union which represented public service workers, like at that time the British Guiana Civil Service Association, which is now the GPSU, and FUGE and the GLU. At that time, I think Mr. Burnham himself might have been president of the GLU. But some unions were opposed. But PPP felt that by controlling the major union, that is the union with thousands of sugar workers, it would guarantee them a stronger control of the country. Third, I believe that because of the feeling that they were opposed by civil society, they're opposed by the public service, opposed by the majority of the electorate, because you had to see society at that time in the mid-60s had a very strong Portuguese business element, a very powerful business element, a very strong working class element through the PNC. So when you combine the electoral strength of the PNC and United Force, you're talking about 58% of the electorate. So the People's Progressive Party felt that it was besieged. And because of that, there was always, from 1953, there was always an effort to pass this labor relations bill so it could decide who controlled the big unions in the country. And the biggest union, I think, would be the union that represented the sugar workers. And the other thing is that they decided to weaponize trade union protests. This never happened before. Workers would go on strike with their cardboard, and they would carry out the Chronicle newspapers and sit down and squat, and they would sing songs, with solidarity forever. It was all, pretty harmless stuff. But in 1964 was different. About 200 members of the Progressive Youth Organization received training overseas. Weapons came into this country from foreign countries. Money came into this country from foreign countries. So it was no longer a song and dance show. It was no longer solidarity forever. This became murderous. So the GAWU strike was not just, let us squat until we get recognition. These people went out and started killing and bombing and arson. Innocent people. I mean, it was indiscriminate. So I would say these factors, the weaponizing of trade union relations, the PPP quest for control, the opposition from the public sector and some of the tongues, in addition to the opposition from the PNC United Force, were major factors. And as a result of that, I would think that the PPP felt that it is no point trying to aim at national unity. They felt that they could divide the country and control the majority. And because of the electoral system and the trade union system, they would be able to do what they want, spend money how they liked. And a divided country, paradoxically, was in the interest of maintaining the PPP in office. So those are four factors which I feel led to the GAWU strike. PPP felt they could pull it off. PPP felt they could pull it off by sheer terror. And I think a factor which is aligned to the weaponizing of the strike is that several socialist countries around the world in the communist bloc at that time supported the PPP. That is how they got money. They got money from the USSR. They got weapons. They sent people overseas for training. And in those days, remember we were still in the post-war period. British Empire was crumbling. Many former colonies were aiming at becoming independent. And in general, many of those leaders were left-wingers because the right-wingers were in favor of colonialism and apartheid and capitalism. But people who were opposed to apartheid, opposed to colonialism, tended to be on the left. And because they were on the left, the PPP sided with them and they supported the PPP because they were all of the left and they felt that the PPP was fighting for Guyana's independence against the British Empire. But they didn't understand that the PPP was not fighting so much against the British Empire. They are fighting against the fellow Guyanese. So those are 4.5 factors, or maybe 5 factors, to answer your question. And as a result of that, the PPP felt they could win. And I must add, because although I don't embrace the ethnic analysis of these political events, the PPP made it a point of duty to ensure that many of its terrorists and trainees were not of one ethnic group. That is what resulted in people like Michael Ford, who was a bomber, becoming a martyr, because the PPP made sure that they recruited people who could be bent to their will from all ethnic groups. And many people were happy to travel overseas for the first time to receive training. And only when they got overseas, they realized that the training was in sabotage. But the PPP, tried to conceal the fact that it was a struggle to control the country by recruiting people, and they still do it now, recruiting people from different sections of the population.
Yeah, indeed, we do see that. For those of you who are now joining us, good evening to you. The PPP is still doing it now, recruiting persons from other ethnic groups to do their dirty bidding. We see a lot of that. We move to our next question. Where did the PPP GAWU violence have its gravest impact? Gravest impact, the PPP GAWU violence.
The records show that Leonora was the epicenter of the strike, GAWU strike. That is where the work stoppages started, and that is where the violence started. And it's a rural area. Well, by definition, all estates are in rural areas, and people live in villages. So the question answers itself. The people who were most impacted were residents of the villages. And the second factor is that when many workers of Indian descent did not show up to work, two things happened. One is that many of the factory workers were of African descent and they continued to go to work. But the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association and the Manpower Citizens Association started to recruit other workers of African ancestry. The result is that the persons who were perceived to be breaking the strike, although the strike was not legal because the GAWU was not a legally recognized union, ended up coming from rural areas. And you don't get the average town person going out to cut cane. I mean, unless you start cutting cane from a young age, it's not something to start doing in your old age. So many of the recruits to cut cane, most of them were cane cutters. Many of the trained workers in the sugar estates were like in the factories and the clerks and so on. It created a sort of division. So that is why the violence at first, as early as February, started out in places like Leonora, and it was difficult for people to move between Meersburg and Blankenberg and the Jealousy and Stewartville and those villages. They saw hell. They saw hell. So it gave the gravest impact. And the first impact was in the rural areas, in those villages which were close to sugar estates. And although the strike could be said to have started in West Demerara at Leonora, it started to migrate onto East Demerara, jump the river. The anomaly is that some villages which did not have workers in the sugar industry, were not associated with the Booker Sugar Estates, started to suffer attacks. This is one of the anomalies, if you want to call it that, of the GAWU strike, especially the murder of the Sealeys in May and Buxton, because these were ordinary peasants. These weren't, estate workers. They were not threatening anybody. A 60-year-old man and his wife going in the back dam to pull up a few roots of cassava, and pick some fruit. So the violence was still in rural areas, but it was deliberate, it was targeted. Not at sugar workers who were breaking the strike, but it became, I won't call it random, it was certainly directed at people who they didn't like. And to create this atmosphere of uneasiness, of fear, trembling, of loathing. That's why I always refer to Lenin's, quotation: "The purpose of terror is to terrorize." And after a while, people were terrified, and people just started to migrate in droves because it was random. And when you read, and I don't intend to deal with it in this program, when you read about the people who were killed, these are ordinary folk. These are schoolboys going, traveling in a bus. These are ordinary people riding bicycles on the road or going back down to pick their crops or something like that. So anybody, could be killed if, they felt they were of the wrong political or racial persuasion, traveling through the wrong area at the wrong time. So there was real fear in the country 60 years ago. And I would say that it had its greatest impact geographically on the rural areas. And I would say that, unfortunately, although this might not have been the original intention, it had an impact racially because people who were being attacked, weren't asked, which party you vote for, which union you belong to. And it took a terrible toll because even persons who were of maybe African ancestry who supported the PPP sometimes came under attack. Because when a crowd is throwing stones or a house is being burned down, this is what happened. People traveling on a train or riding a bicycle on the road. It was a very dangerous atmosphere and a very dangerous situation. But I would say that the impact was in rural areas, in the villages, and many villages, I think, still remember what happened at that time. Because if you look back at the 1961 election, uh, there was something called a motorcade from Crabwood Creek to Georgetown, a victory parade, victory motorcade. And some very unpleasant things happened. But of course, if you come from Region 6, between Crabwood Creek and Georgetown is pure countryside, pure rural areas. And the scenes were terrible. Even people who had supported the PPP were really terribly outraged by what took place. The arrogance, um, among the so-called victors. Elections shouldn't be a matter of victory and defeat. It should be a member, okay, you exercise your franchise, you voted, and let us get on with our lives. But I think the motorcade coming through Region 6, Region 5, and Region 4 in the aftermath of the 1961 elections in August really set the tone of very hostile race relations, and we haven't really recovered from that since then.
Certainly haven't recovered since then. It takes us to our final question. And I know that our listening audience get a first-hand view of what the PPP through GAWU they were able to do with serious acts of terrorism, using the sugar industry for just that purpose. And it's very sad to know what the PPP has done to terrorize Guyanese during those years. We see lots of evidence of the same happening today, 2024. 60 years after, 60 years after, PPP hasn't changed. Very sad indeed. Takes us to our final question, Mr. Granger. And it's very important to all of our listeners. Who suffered first and most from GAWU's violence, the PPP, GAWU's violence during those years?
It is the answer, I think, is, as I said before, the people in the ruling, geographically, villages suffered most because many of them were not sugar workers, they were not involved in political matters, they were just ordinary farmers. But apart from the geography of the violence, I think organizationally or from the point of view of employment, I would say members of the opposition unions, particularly the British Guiana Civil Service Association, which has now become the the GPSU. It was then called the British Guiana Civil Service Association. They were penalized, and since then the BGSU has had a very difficult time to get fair salaries from any PPP administration, frankly. And of course, members of the MPCA, well, MPCA was virtually destroyed as a political force, and many sugar workers simply switched. So it wasn't difficult for them, even though the MPCA had a good record from 1939 to 1964. That's about 25 years or so. This 35 years, and they switched very quickly onto the GAWU. That was the winning card. And to a lesser extent, I wouldn't say lesser, at another level, the PPP political opponents suffered because there were occasions, and we'll come to this in another edition of the public interest, the Abraham family massacre. The Abrahams were not sugar workers by any means. They were a Catholic Portuguese family, living all of 50 meters away from the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. But they were certainly victims of the violence. Maybe it's not fair to call it GAWU violence. It's possible to call them the violence of the Hurricane of Protest. But persons of Portuguese ancestry, for example, Godfrey Teixeira, who was killed on the 23rd of March, 1964, when a bomb was thrown into the Boca Sugar Estate bus. He was Portuguese ancestry. So any opponent of the PPP could become a victim once you let the baku out of the bottle. It just can't be controlled. You can't get it back in the bottle. So that is what was happening. And although I would say that the country folk, the rural folk, suffered first, and perhaps suffered most, we cannot be sure how the numbers are composed. For example, the police records state that about 176 persons were killed during the period of the strike, that is February to July. But killings continued right into 1965. And there were people, for example, the biggest massacre of the disturbances was Huradaya, as workers were going from Georgetown to Mackenzie. About 50 persons died in that blast, and these were not sugar workers. And Mackenzie is strictly speaking in that country. It is basically a mining settlement. But there again, there were different motives for that a terrorist attack on the Huradaya. So I would say, therefore, that the victims of the violence during the disturbances not only included poor villagers close to sugar estates, but also included persons perceived to be political opponents of the PPP, members of rival or other unions, including the MPCA, the British Guiana Civil Service Association, and maybe other people whose death was likely to create this environment of fear and loathing and terror and trembling. So that is what was happening. There's a saying, a French saying, pour encourager les autres. So when people look around and see what happens to innocent people, say, other people would, would be very nervous, very cautious when they see that, death was coming to people who were not involved in any form of struggle. It was just, it's almost like Gaza as far as some people were concerned. A lot of families lost members, and the 176 people that the police said were killed, is probably a gross understatement. But I would say that those are the categories of people who suffered first and who suffered most because of the hurricane of protests and the GAWU violence between February and July 1964.
Thank you so much, Mr. Granger. So sad just listening to the reign of terror initiated by the PPP regime. We're seeing signs of that again, even during their 23 plus years in office. We saw some very, very deadly years where they recruited individuals, and almost everybody should know that story by now. We're seeing signs again of total control and acts of terrorism. In 2020, they stoned a school bus with school children inside. They beat policemen, all manner of things, nurses, innocent folks on the streets. It's horrible. And I'm so glad that you're able to walk us through the People's Progressive Party and the fact that they have introduced terrorism and violence to Guyana. This is something our young people especially should never forget. They must understand their history. And of course, we're the strike the strike back then in 1964, the PPP affiliated Guyana Agriculture Workers Union. They weren't really fighting for union workers. They weren't fighting for sugar workers. It was basically acts of terrorism, especially during the hurricane of protests of 1964. Maybe this explains why the PPP loves to ensure that they keep GAWU close to them by giving them billions and billions of dollars to an ailing sugar industry. And so I'm thankful that you were able to walk us through this period there, the hurricane of violence. And I hope our listeners, you walk away with something this evening, but how deadly it was back then and how dangerous it is today, even as we prepare for that, what they say, the budget on Monday. That's the budget, January 15th budget. I don't know. Before we go, Mr. Granger, any optimism on the budget as they start on the 15th?
No, I think the PPP has a record of 74 years in this country, and they'll probably give some spoonful to a few sections of the population, but basically we know where the money is going to go to, and it's not going to go to improving the quality of life of ordinary Guyanese. It's going to go into some projects, and I believe that the condition of living or the standard of living of the ordinary Guyanese will be the same on the sort of 15th of January 2025 as we go into election year. But the PPP is preparing for elections, and they'll do certain things to encourage support closer to election. Then they'll go back to form. So I don't have any illusions about the PPP administration in this country. It is not people oriented; it is project oriented. They're not the same.
Not people's oriented, project oriented, questionable projects. Also. Questionable project. Mr. Granger, thank you so much for your time as always. Please give my regards to Mistress Granger and continue to have yourself a wonderful rest of the evening, and God bless.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. And to all our listeners, same to you. See you guys, same place, same time, right here on 107.1 FM, GAWU Education. So long.
Sun a go down, but up the river. Some washing clothes, some folks are bathing at the water. Fishermen, they catch them a bring. From a canoe boat, man, them start offloading. Aymara, Kwakwari, Gale Baka Kuma Kuma, even Lokonani. Aymara, Kwakwari, Gale Baka Kuma Kuma, even Bangameri. Listen to this.
Yeah, my name is Jasmine Caldata from CC Vietnam, and since 1965 I become a voter, and I always place my X next to the cup. And what they are doing today, I can't take it. So I have no more vote to give to PPP anymore. I'm not going to vote anymore no more. If they have to lose by one vote, they're losing it by data.
Hello, this is attorney Shellen Washington, owner and founder of the Washington Law Firm, located at 455 Utica Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. We're specialized in medical malpractice, personal injuries, matrimonial law, and landlord and tenant. If you're in need of legal representation, please give us a call today. The number to call is 718-877-3100. Consultation is free at no cost to you. So call us today to see if we can be of any assistance to your legal needs. Again, the phone number to call us is 718-877-3100.
Made rapid progress with this great success. And over Guyanese Matramani, the Republican free. Matramani, big bed for you and me. Matramani, it's really nice to see everybody rejoicing, celebrating matrimony.